At dawn near Karánsebes in September 1788, the expected enemy had not yet delivered the decisive blow, yet parts of the Habsburg army already appeared to have come apart from within. Wagons stood overturned or abandoned, riderless horses moved through disordered ground, equipment had been dropped along roads and camp areas, scattered fires still burned, and officers faced a question more disturbing than an ordinary battlefield defeat: how could a major European army collapse before the battle it had been preparing to fight? At the center of the campaign stood Emperor Joseph II, ruler of the Habsburg monarchy and commander of forces operating against the Ottoman Empire during the Austro-Turkish War of 1787–1791. His army in the Banat was large, multinational, and difficult to control even under favorable conditions. German-speaking troops served beside Hungarians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Italians, and men from other parts of the Habsburg lands, creating a military force whose diversity reflected the empire itself but also complicated communication across units, officers, and languages. Somewhere within that unstable system, according to the traditional narrative of Karánsebes, a routine reconnaissance movement became the beginning of extraordinary confusion. Later accounts describe Hussars moving ahead of the main army, encountering local sellers of schnapps, and becoming involved in a dispute when infantrymen also wanted access to the alcohol. The details are famous, but they are not equally secure. The surviving contemporary record does not preserve a complete moment-by-moment account of the night, and modern historians have good reason to treat some of the most colorful elements cautiously. What does emerge from the broader tradition is a chain of escalating uncertainty: an argument, a gunshot or alarm, cries that Ottoman troops were approaching, formations moving in darkness, commands being misunderstood, and soldiers losing confidence in their ability to distinguish friend from enemy. One of the best-known later details claims that shouted orders of "Halt" were misheard by some soldiers as "Allah," reinforcing the fear that Ottoman troops had entered the camp. Whether that exchange occurred exactly as later retellings describe remains disputed, but the story captures the central danger of the night: information moved faster than verification. Cavalry, infantry, artillery, and command elements reportedly began reacting to one another as though hostile forces had penetrated their positions. Joseph II and his officers attempted to restore order, yet darkness, frightened movement, fragmented communication, and mistaken identification made coherent command increasingly difficult. By the time daylight exposed what had happened, the Austrian army had withdrawn or become badly disorganized, while the main Ottoman advance into the area came afterward. That sequence created the legend that has followed Karánsebes ever since, an army supposedly defeating itself before its enemy arrived. Later history sometimes placed Austrian losses as high as 10,000 men, but that famous figure must not be treated as a securely documented casualty total. Surviving contemporary evidence does not establish the exact number with certainty, and modern scholarship approaches the claim cautiously. The same caution applies to the phrase that the soldiers fought themselves over alcohol. Schnapps may have been a trigger in the traditional narrative, but alcohol alone cannot explain what followed. The deeper story involves nighttime panic, multilingual command problems, rumor, poor identification, discipline breakdown, and the terrifying speed with which one false alarm can become battlefield reality. To understand Karánsebes, the question is not simply whether men drank too much. It is how an imperial army lost control of what it believed it was seeing, hearing, and fighting before the real enemy had fully arrived. The disaster at Karánsebes cannot be understood without first seeing the army that Emperor Joseph II had brought into the Banat in 1788 and the strategic pressure surrounding it. The Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman Empire had contested southeastern Europe for generations, and the Austro-Turkish War of 1787–1791 placed Joseph II in a difficult position along a frontier where roads, rivers, fortresses, supply lines, disease, and uncertain intelligence could matter as much as battlefield strength. Karánsebes lay within this unstable military environment, close enough to active routes and potential Ottoman movement that reconnaissance, camp security, and rapid reaction were essential. Joseph II was not commanding a simple national army. His imperial forces drew men from across the Habsburg lands, including German-speaking troops, Hungarians, Romanians, Serbs, Croats, Italians, and others who brought different languages, dialects, regional identities, and military traditions into the same campaign. The army did possess formal chains of command, established signals, officers, regulations, and methods for transmitting orders, so multilingualism by itself did not make collapse inevitable. Under normal conditions, armies had procedures precisely because soldiers did not all share the same background. The danger came when those procedures had to function in darkness, under fatigue, across moving columns, with poor visibility, scattered units, nervous cavalry screens, artillery trains, and troops expecting enemy contact at any moment. Joseph II and senior officers, including Field Marshal Franz Moritz von Lacy, operated within a command system already strained by the realities of campaigning in the Banat. The surviving evidence shows that the Habsburg war effort faced serious operational difficulties, but it does not justify assigning every later failure at Karánsebes to one commander or one organizational defect. What matters is the accumulation of vulnerabilities. Infantry columns had to keep position on uncertain roads. Cavalry patrols moved ahead to detect Ottoman forces before they could surprise the main body. Artillery and wagons required space, timing, and protection. River crossings complicated movement further because units could become separated, slowed, or compressed as men, horses, guns, and supplies passed through narrow approaches. During daylight, officers could often correct spacing and identify nearby formations. At night, recognition became harder. A distant movement might be friendly cavalry returning from reconnaissance, or it might be an enemy screen. A shouted warning might pass clearly through one unit and become distorted before reaching another. A command understood in German might need to be interpreted, repeated, or simply inferred elsewhere. None of this meant that every soldier was incapable of understanding his officers. It meant that the margin for error became much smaller once fear entered the system. By September 17, 1788, the army was moving and camping under the expectation that Ottoman contact could come suddenly. Men were tired, horses were restless, roads and river approaches were crowded, and units depended on information coming from those operating ahead of the main body. Later narratives placed the decisive first scene near the Timis, also known historically as the Thames River, where cavalry reconnaissance moved beyond or ahead of the principal Habsburg formations. According to the traditional account, a group of Hussars or mounted scouts encountered local sellers carrying schnapps. The surviving contemporary evidence does not allow every detail of that meeting to be reconstructed with confidence, and later retellings clearly added dramatic precision that the earlier record does not always support. Even so, the episode became central to the story because of what supposedly followed. A routine reconnaissance stop, a small quantity of alcohol, and a disagreement between men from the same army would later be remembered as the moment when an already tense military system began moving toward panic. According to the traditional narrative, the next stage of the Karánsebes disaster began with something far smaller than a battle. During the night of September 17 to 18, 1788, cavalry reconnaissance operating ahead of the main Habsburg body crossed or moved near the Timis, historically also called the Thames, and encountered local people selling schnapps or other spirits. Later accounts say the Hussars purchased the alcohol and began drinking while they waited, rested, or held position beyond the river. That scene has become one of the most famous elements in the story, but the surviving evidence is not strong enough to treat every gesture, quantity, and sequence as firmly documented. What matters is how later narratives connect the episode to the breakdown that followed. After some time, infantry elements reached the same area and either asked for or demanded a share of the alcohol. The cavalry refused. What may have begun as a dispute over drink now unfolded in darkness among tired men from different units, speaking different languages and dialects, with no clear shared understanding of what was happening beyond their immediate group. Voices rose. Orders, insults, warnings, and explanations could easily be confused when passed through a crowd at night, especially in an army already expecting Ottoman contact. An anonymous Imperial Austrian Hussar can represent the field-level visual perspective here, not as a documented named participant but as a continuity figure through whom the viewer sees the uncertainty of the scene, mounted soldiers near the river, infantry pressing closer, lantern light, restless horses, weapons close at hand, and men trying to understand whether they are facing a quarrel or something more dangerous. Then a gunshot is heard. The surviving record does not securely establish who fired first or why, and the story should not pretend otherwise. Yet as a narrative turning point, the shot changes everything. Once a weapon has discharged in a tense night environment, the event can no longer be contained as a simple argument. Men farther away do not know whether the sound came from a drunken dispute, an accidental discharge, a warning, or an actual enemy attack. They only know that a shot has been fired where Ottoman forces are expected to appear. Rumor now outruns verification. Cries of "Turks," or their equivalent begin passing from group to group. Each repetition adds urgency while removing context. Soldiers who never saw the original dispute hear only alarm. Mounted movement in the darkness becomes suspicious. Infantry shifting position becomes evidence of attack. Horses breaking formation create noise that sounds like cavalry approaching. Alcohol may have weakened discipline in the traditional version of events, but alcohol alone cannot explain the collapse that follows. The situation required several vulnerabilities to combine at once: poor visibility, scattered troops, language barriers, fear of Ottoman cavalry, exhaustion, fragmented information, and the absence of any shared picture of the battlefield. Men react to what they think is happening before officers can establish what is actually happening. In a modern command system, uncertainty can be dangerous. In a late 18th century army spread across roads, river crossings, camps, and columns at night, uncertainty could become contagious. By the time the alarm reaches troops who were never near the schnapps, the original dispute has already disappeared from view. They hear movement, shouting, hoofbeats, and gunfire, and begin reacting to friendly formations as though an Ottoman attack has begun. By this point, the danger had moved far beyond the original quarrel. In the darkness around Karánsebes, frightened troops began shifting position, shouting warnings, trying to form ranks, and reacting to sounds they could not clearly identify. The Habsburg army was multinational, and although it had formal command structures, the pressure of the moment made simple orders harder to transmit cleanly across units speaking different languages and dialects. A command shouted in one accent could be repeated differently by another soldier, then carried farther through noise, movement, and fear until its original meaning was weakened or lost. One of the most famous details in later retellings claims that officers shouted, "Halt! Halt!" in an attempt to stop men from running or firing, while some soldiers supposedly heard something resembling Allah, Allah, and interpreted it as evidence that Ottoman troops were already among them. This episode has become central to the legend of Karánsebes, but the surviving contemporary record does not establish it beyond dispute, and it must be treated as a later narrative element rather than a certain transcript of the night. Even without that famous misunderstanding, the mechanics of panic are easy to see. Cavalry moving rapidly through darkness could appear to infantry as the silhouette of an enemy charge. Infantry firing toward uncertain movement could convince mounted troops that Ottoman forces had penetrated the camp. Horses turning, men running, wagons shifting, and units attempting to regroup could all become signs of attack when nobody possessed a reliable view of the whole situation. Every new shot then created more apparent evidence that the alarm was real. At the command level, Emperor Joseph II and his officers faced an increasingly impossible problem. Orders could be sent. Messengers could be dispatched. Units could be told to halt, reform, or identify themselves. But the reports returning toward headquarters were contradictory. One group might claim enemy cavalry had appeared. Another might report shooting inside the camp. A third might be moving because it had heard the first two groups were already under attack. Joseph II did not have the advantage of instantly knowing that the disturbance had begun from within his own lines, and there is no reason to invent a dramatic moment in which he suddenly understood the entire chain of events. Command depended on information, and the information system itself was breaking down. The most dangerous force now was no longer the schnapps described in the traditional story. It was a self-reinforcing failure of perception. Rumor caused movement. Movement looked like enemy action. That movement drew gunfire. The gunfire then appeared to confirm the original rumor that the Ottomans had arrived. Each reaction became evidence for the next reaction, even when the perceived threat remained unverified. Officers trying to restore order were now competing against a battlefield story that seemed to prove itself every few seconds. The panic spread outward from the first confused groups, reaching soldiers who had never seen the reconnaissance party, never witnessed the dispute, and may never have known alcohol was involved at all. Larger infantry and cavalry elements began responding to one another through sound, shadow, and fear, and the army moved closer to the point where friendly formations could no longer reliably recognize each other before reacting. As the panic spread, the Habsburg army's different arms began to become sources of fear for one another. In darkness, without a clearly understood front line, cavalry, infantry, and artillery could all produce the sights and sounds of an enemy attack. Mounted troops moving quickly through the camp or along nearby roads could appear to infantry as Ottoman cavalry breaking through. Infantry firing toward uncertain silhouettes could make horsemen believe hostile forces had already penetrated the position. Some later accounts describe artillery crews or commanders responding to what they thought were mounted enemy threats and firing toward movement they could not properly identify, but the surviving record does not securely establish every battery, every volley, or every unit involved. What matters is the effect such firing could have on an army already trapped inside a false picture of the battlefield. Horses could bolt from noise and sudden movement. Wagons could block roads or crossing points. Infantry formations attempting to turn or regroup could collide with men moving in the opposite direction. Soldiers might abandon positions because they believed another section had already been overrun, while that section was itself withdrawing from a different friendly formation it had mistaken for the enemy. The anonymous Hussar who has served as a field-level visual perspective now moves through a world where recognition has almost disappeared. He does not need to be given invented thoughts or dialogue for the danger to be clear, nearby silhouettes cannot be trusted, shouted commands compete with gunfire, and the direction of supposed enemy contact changes from moment to moment. At the command level, Emperor Joseph II and his officers faced the same crisis on a larger scale. Reports arriving from different parts of the army could describe enemy cavalry, firing inside the camp, retreating troops, blocked routes, and units that could no longer locate neighboring formations. Joseph II could issue orders and send messengers, but a command system can only restore order if the information moving through it remains recognizable. Here, the army was receiving contradictory signals from its own movements. Later stories sometimes placed Joseph II personally in extreme danger or separated from parts of his staff during the confusion, but such dramatic details should be treated cautiously unless tied to specific evidence. The important point is not whether every sensational anecdote is true. It is that command cohesion was visibly failing. Nor does this mean that every soldier was drunk, that every unit fired on every other unit, or that the entire Habsburg army dissolved in exactly the same way at the same moment. The breakdown was uneven. Some formations may have retained greater discipline. Others were pulled into panic by the movements of troops around them. The catastrophe grew because fragmented perception replaced a shared battlefield picture. A unit could retreat because it heard firing ahead. Another could see that retreat and assume the enemy had broken through. A third could respond to the second unit's movement as proof of attack. Each reaction strengthened the next misunderstanding. By the time officers attempted to re-establish control, withdrawal was already beginning in parts of the force. The battle everyone had expected against the Ottoman army was being preempted by the Habsburg army's own fear, misidentification, and collapse of communication. Before the main enemy force could determine the shape of the confrontation, the Imperial army had already begun pulling itself away from the ground where that confrontation was supposed to occur. By dawn, the confusion around Karánsebes had become an operational problem rather than a single episode of panic. Parts of the Habsburg army had moved away from their intended positions, units had become separated, equipment and wagons had been left behind, horses were exhausted or difficult to control, and officers were trying to determine where their men had gone and how quickly formations could be rebuilt. Camp areas that should have supported an organized advance now reflected the consequences of a night in which movement, rumor, and mistaken identification had overwhelmed normal command. Emperor Joseph II faced the task of understanding what had happened while still operating in an active campaign against the Ottoman Empire. Surviving correspondence and contemporary military records are especially important at this stage because later retellings often describe the aftermath with greater dramatic certainty than the evidence allows. Joseph II's own writings from the campaign reveal deep frustration with disorder, fear, poor discipline, and the difficulties of controlling troops under pressure, but those documents must be read carefully rather than turned into a complete transcript of the night. They support the broader picture of an army shaken by panic and confusion, yet they do not settle every later claim about exactly who fired, how many formations broke, or how the first alarm spread through every part of the force. Commanders now had to reassemble infantry, recover cavalry, restore artillery organization, locate missing equipment, reopen movement routes, and determine whether the Ottoman threat they had feared during the night was finally approaching in reality. Later accounts repeatedly emphasize the irony that Ottoman forces arrived only after the Habsburg army had already damaged its own position through confusion and withdrawal. Some versions say the Ottomans found Karánsebes abandoned or seriously weakened and were able to occupy the area or exploit the retreat with comparatively little immediate resistance. The exact timing, sequence, and scale of that advance are described differently across retellings, so it would be misleading to reduce the episode to the absolute claim that the Ottomans simply won without firing a shot. What the surviving tradition does make clear is the contrast between the expected confrontation and what actually disrupted Joseph II's army first. The decisive breakdown around Karánsebes was not initially produced by an organized Ottoman assault against the main Habsburg force. It was produced primarily by internal panic, uncertain information, mistaken identification, and the collapse of coordination during the night. That distinction mattered strategically and politically. A conventional defeat could be explained through enemy strength, terrain, maneuver, or tactical failure. An army disorganizing itself before the expected engagement was far more embarrassing because it exposed weaknesses inside the imperial command system itself. Joseph II's campaign already faced the pressures of disease, logistics, difficult terrain, strained communications, and an uncertain enemy. Karánsebes added something harder to explain, the possibility that fear and confusion could neutralize military strength before the enemy had fully tested it. Yet the most famous numbers attached to the episode remain another problem entirely. Later writers would describe enormous Austrian losses, sometimes placing them as high as 10,000 men, and the story would gradually acquire the shape of one of history's most extraordinary friendly fire catastrophes. But how many men were actually lost, wounded, missing, or temporarily scattered? And how much of the version remembered today belongs to the surviving evidence from 1788, rather than to the legends that grew around Karánsebes afterward? The number 10,000 has become one of the most recognizable claims attached to Karánsebes, but it is also one of the least secure when examined against the surviving evidence. Later accounts claimed losses as high as 10,000, and that figure has been repeated widely in popular histories, articles, and modern internet retellings. Yet the contemporary record does not securely establish that exactly 10,000 Habsburg soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing because of friendly fire during the night. The figure is disputed, and modern historians treat it cautiously. Part of the problem is that different categories of loss are often collapsed into one dramatic number. Men could be killed, wounded, separated from their units, temporarily missing, dispersed during retreat, sick from campaign conditions, or lost later in the broader operation. Treating every one of those categories as if they represented casualties from a single night of self-inflicted fighting creates a certainty the evidence does not support. The source chain also matters. Joseph II's contemporary correspondence and surviving Habsburg military documents are the closest evidence to the events, but they do not provide the complete, cinematic account that later generations came to expect. 19th-century narratives often retold the episode with clearer sequences, stronger numbers, and more memorable details. Modern retellings then frequently inherited those details without always separating contemporary documentation from later storytelling. As the story passed from one source to another, the most vivid elements became easier to remember than the uncertainty surrounding them. The same caution applies to the schnapps episode. Alcohol appears prominently in the traditional narrative, but the precise circumstances of who bought it, how much was consumed, and exactly how the dispute unfolded are not all equally well established. The famous Halt and Allah misunderstanding faces the same problem. It is an effective explanation for how multilingual panic might have intensified, but it is one of the best-known later details rather than an indisputable transcript preserved from the night itself. Claims that Ottoman troops later arrived and found thousands of Austrian dead must also be examined carefully rather than repeated as settled fact. None of this requires dismissing Karánsebes as a fabrication. A real episode of severe panic, mistaken identification, disorder, and friendly fire confusion can exist even when casualty totals are uncertain and later descriptions are embellished. In fact, separating evidence from legend makes the event more historically revealing. The important question is not whether every popular detail survives scrutiny exactly as told. It is why the underlying breakdown was plausible at all. A multinational imperial army operating at night, expecting enemy contact, already strained by fatigue, difficult terrain, fragmented information, and command problems, could react catastrophically once fear began reinforcing itself. The surviving evidence supports caution about the exact scale, but caution does not erase the larger lesson. Karánsebes became famous because it represented a military system losing the ability to distinguish rumor from intelligence and friendly movement from hostile action. The strangest part, therefore, may not be a perfectly documented moment in which exactly 10,000 men destroyed one another. It may be the more defensible reality that a major imperial army could lose cohesion so badly, through panic and miscommunication, before confirmed contact with the enemy it had marched there to fight. The phrase, fighting themselves over alcohol, captures one real feature of the traditional Karánsebes narrative, but it compresses a much larger military failure into a single dramatic cause. In the later story, alcohol appears at the beginning of the chain. Cavalry scouts or Hussars operating ahead of the main Habsburg body encounter local sellers of schnapps, purchase the drink, and become involved in a dispute when infantrymen arrive and want a share. That episode explains how a small quarrel might begin, but it does not explain how confusion could spread across a major imperial force. The larger mechanism was far more dangerous. Darkness limited identification. Soldiers were already nervous about Ottoman contact. Units were fragmented by movement, river crossings, roads, wagons, and camp positions. The army included men speaking German, Hungarian, Romanian, Serbian, Croatian, Italian, and other languages or dialects. Rumor moved from group to group faster than commanders could verify it. Cavalry movement could look like an enemy charge. Friendly gunfire could appear to confirm that hostile troops had broken into the camp. Once fear began feeding on incomplete information, every reaction created evidence for the next mistake. The famous figure of 10,000 must be understood with the same caution. In the title, it represents the upper-end number repeated in later accounts, not a securely verified contemporary count of 10,000 men killed by their own comrades. The surviving evidence does not establish such a precise total, and the number should not be treated as certain deaths. Some later narratives claimed losses as high as 10,000, but modern historical treatment must distinguish confirmed casualties from missing men, dispersed soldiers, wounded personnel, sickness, and broader campaign losses. The most defensible reconstruction is therefore restrained. Reconnaissance or cavalry elements move ahead near the Timis or Thames. According to the traditional account, they encounter sellers of alcohol. Infantry arrives, a dispute develops, and a gunshot is heard. The origin and intention of that shot cannot be reconstructed with confidence. The sound is interpreted as possible Ottoman contact. An alarm of Turks spreads. Commands are shouted through darkness and noise. Friendly formations misidentify one another. Cavalry, infantry, and perhaps artillery react to movements they believe are hostile. Gunfire reinforces the false picture. Emperor Joseph II and his officers attempt to restore order, but headquarters receives contradictory reports and the command system loses a reliable understanding of events. The anonymous representative Hussar who has followed the story at ground level now serves only as a visual anchor for that uncertainty, not as a source of invented memories or dialogue. Withdrawal follows as cohesion breaks. Ottoman forces later exploit the weakened or abandoned position, although the precise timing and degree of direct Ottoman involvement differ across accounts. Karánsebes became famous because the story concentrates several universal military dangers into one night: fear, language barriers, alcohol, rumor, poor visibility, mistaken identity, and friendly fire. Any one of those factors might have been manageable alone. Combined, they could turn uncertainty into a self-sustaining battlefield reality. That is why the event survives even when its most dramatic numbers remain disputed. The deeper failure was not simply drunkenness, and it was not a neatly documented mass self-destruction. It was the collapse of a large army's ability to agree on what was happening around it. The Habsburg monarchy remained at war after Karánsebes, and Joseph II still faced the Ottoman campaign ahead, but the episode had already demonstrated that internal disorder could become as dangerous as the enemy his army had marched south to confront. Karánsebes did not decide the Austro-Turkish War, and it should not be remembered as though one strange night determined the fate of the Habsburg campaign. The conflict continued until 1791, while Emperor Joseph II and his forces faced problems far larger than a single episode of panic. Campaigning in the Banat placed enormous pressure on logistics, supply, transport, medical support, movement across difficult ground, and coordination between widely separated formations. Disease weakened armies across 18th-century campaigns, and command friction grew whenever exhausted troops, uncertain intelligence, difficult roads, river crossings, and multilingual units had to operate under pressure. Joseph II's military reputation was shaped by these broader difficulties as much as by the confusion associated with Karánsebes. His army was not simply an undisciplined mass incapable of functioning because its soldiers spoke different languages. It was a complex imperial force with established officers, regulations, and chains of command, but those systems became vulnerable when darkness, fatigue, rumor, poor visibility, and fear of Ottoman contact placed extraordinary demands on them. What happened near Karánsebes became memorable because later historians and popular writers gradually transformed that vulnerability into an almost perfect cautionary tale: an army waiting for its enemy somehow turned against itself before the enemy fully arrived. Over time, the story accumulated increasingly vivid details. Schnapps became the unmistakable spark. The dispute between cavalry and infantry became more precise. The cry of "Turks" became a dramatic turning point. The supposed confusion between "Halt" and "Allah" became one of the most repeated scenes. The number of losses hardened into a memorable figure. Modern media then inherited a version that could be told quickly, clearly, and with extraordinary irony. Archival evidence requires a more disciplined conclusion. Serious panic, confusion, disorder, and friendly force misidentification appear to lie behind the historical episode, but the surviving record does not verify every famous detail with equal certainty. The figure of 10,000 troops is a famous disputed number repeated in later accounts, not a securely established contemporary count of men killed in one night. Fighting themselves describes friendly force confusion, mistaken identification, and units reacting against other imperial formations. It does not mean two organized Austrian armies deliberately formed battle lines against one another. Over alcohol points to the traditional Schnapps episode as a possible trigger, not to alcohol as the single explanation for the collapse. The deeper military lesson is about systems. Command discipline matters most when information becomes uncertain. Multilingual communication requires procedures strong enough to survive noise and fear. Night operations magnify every weakness in recognition and control. Rumors must be verified before they become orders in practice. Alcohol can increase discipline risk, but it becomes truly dangerous when combined with fatigue, weapons, uncertainty, and expectation of attack. Friendly identification is not a minor battlefield detail. When soldiers cannot distinguish their own movement from enemy movement, every defensive reaction can intensify the mistake. Historical memory requires the same discipline. Sources must be weighed by date, proximity, purpose, and reliability, especially when later narratives become more detailed than contemporary records. That is why Karánsebes remains powerful even after its legend is stripped of false certainty. Its lasting significance does not depend on proving every sensational anecdote or accepting every casualty figure. It endures because the surviving story exposes something far more unsettling. A large army can possess weapons, officers, numbers, and organization, yet still become its own greatest threat when fear moves faster than information, when rumor replaces verification, and when command loses the ability to tell its soldiers what is actually happening around them.